I'm going to be talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh today. Now, as you can see, this is going to be one of those reviews where I'm pointing the camera at the book instead of at my face because I think there are some interesting things in the book that I'd like to point out as I go through them. So apologies for not being able to see my face, and apologies in advance if my hand starts shaking during the video, as it sometimes does when I have to hold the camera like this for too long. Uh, Sorry, apologies in advance. But yes, the Epic of Gilgamesh. So I'll start off by trying to give some brief background information on this. The Epic of Gilgamesh is, I believe, the oldest written story that we have that survives down to us, like the oldest in the world. So, in the history of world literature, this is all the way at the beginning. And I am reading this book in part because of Steve Donahue's series on reading the Western canon. Steve Donahue has a whole series of videos on this, but the basic thesis behind these videos is if you're going to make a project of reading the classics, it's best to do that systematically rather than haphazardly. Because each classic work builds on or is influenced by the classics that have come before. So the idea is you start all the way at the beginning and then you work your way through. Now, Steve Donahue, in his Western canon starter kit, actually bypasses the Epic of Gilgamesh. He starts with the Bible. And he says, you can read the Epic of Gilgamesh if you want. It's all in fragments, so it doesn't really matter which fragment you read, I believe is what he says about that. But he bypasses it on his Western canon starter kit. And he doesn't say so exactly, but I believe the reason why he bypasses it is despite being so old, the Epic of Gilgamesh was lost to history for about almost 2,000 years. So nobody knew it existed. It was just buried in the sands of Iraq, and it was when people were writing literature in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Victorian era, nobody actually knew about the Epic of Gilgamesh until it was discovered, I believe, in 1850. Okay, so at the middle of the Victorian era, but you get what I mean. So it, as an influence, at least on Western literature as we know it, it was largely absent. But, well, this is the interesting part, maybe. It was very popular in its time. And this is the interesting thing that I learned reading this. So I vaguely knew about the Epic of Gilgamesh. I had listened to a lecture on it in the history of world literature from the Great Courses series by Grant Vaught, who talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh. But I had always imagined that the Epic of Gilgamesh was just like this clay tablet which was unearthed in an archaeological dig, and it was just like a chance of history that we happened to find this clay tablet with some of the Epic of Gilgamesh on it. What I learned from the author's introduction, though, from the translator's introduction, which was really interesting to me, is that we actually have lots and lots of tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh, because this epic was very popular and very influential in its day. It started out as a Sumerian story, and then as the language of the Mesopotamian Empire transferred from Sumerian to Akkadian, becoming an Akkadian story. Yeah. So went from Sumerian, so older copies of Gilgamesh in Sumerian, and then it became Akkadian, and then there were the Middle Babylonian versions. And there were also translations made in other languages during this time. There was like a Hittite translation. So the poem over this 2,000-year period. So, yeah, the first copies of the poem are made about 2000 BC, and that history goes all the way up to 100 BC. So a 2,000-year period in which this poem was being copied out and translated and spread across the ancient Mesopotamia. And we don't just have one copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh. We have many different copies, all of them fragments. But from those fragments, we are able to put together the story. And there are still some gaps in the text, but we now have most of it, or well over half of the text. What was it, 70% or something? Some parts have more gaps than other parts, as you can see just by flipping through the book. All these dotted lines indicate a gap in the text. And the translator talks about how more and more pieces are being found all the time, which surprised me. I thought this was like a done deal. We had dug up everything that there was to dig up. But during the period where this epic was influential in the ancient Mesopotamian Empire, the Sumerian and Akkadian Empire, and then down into the Babylonian Empire, this epic was, I guess, like the standard epic of those civilizations. So it was like to the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians what Homer was to the ancient Greeks, I guess. So yeah, it's different than what I thought, which was just, this random story that we just happened to find in an archaeological dig. This was a whole 2,000-year tradition. And there are, in this Penguin Classic edition, there are different versions. So they start off with what they call the standard version. And the standard version, I guess, is the version which was compiled in the Babylonian times. And it's called the standard version, I think, because there are so many different copies of it. And again, we still don't have the whole thing because we're collecting it in fragments. But this was the copy that was widely circulated in the Babylonian Empire. And then that, in this Penguin edition, that lasts to page 100. So there's about 50 pages of introduction in which the translator gives some of the history of this epic. And then the standard version itself is 100 pages. And then the rest of the stuff in this translation, in this edition, is just different versions of it aside from the standard version. Now, when I first got this book out of the library and I realized that there was all this extra stuff after you get through the traditional standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, I thought, okay, I've got it in me to read one version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but are you going to make me read through all these other versions here? But it was actually pretty interesting once you got into it to see the different versions. And then the very last thing is the Sumerian poems, which is the oldest version we have. And in some ways it's a completely different story, or it's 5 different poems, so 5 different stories. But you can see where the elements of what is later going to go on to become the standard version are there. So you can see the story in embryo here that later editors would refine into the standard version. And as the translator says, it's interesting to see what themes would later be emphasized or reworked into the standard version, so you can appreciate what the author of the standard version, or what the authors, perhaps, of the standard version are trying to do thematically and artistically, how they're reworking those themes from the early poems. So, maybe now is a good time to give a brief summary of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and spoilers here. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is probably based on a real historical figure. As we can see in this timeline here, Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. In Sumerian, he had a slightly different translation of his name. They called him Bilgames, but the same historical figure, just the difference between the Sumerian translation and the Babylonian translation. Anyways, he was half divine. His mother was a goddess, and he just had way too much energy, and he was tyrannizing his people. It's not completely clear here that the translator gives some ideas of how he was tyrannizing them. Maybe he was doing too many building projects, maybe he was fighting too many wars, but he just had relentless energy, and his people were crying out for relief. So the gods, in response to this cry, created a man out of clay, which was a wild man. His name was Enkidu, and he's out living with the animals. And while he's living with the animals, he's causing trouble to the hunter, because he's able to upset all the hunter's traps, and he and his herds are able to. Enkidu is running with the herds of antelope, or the gazelle. He's out running with the herds. I forget which animal. So the hunter asks for advice from the gods, and the gods tell the hunter that if he wants relief, he should get the harlot to come out, the prostitute. So he does so, and she comes out, and they copulate for 6 or 7 days. 6 days or 7 nights or something like that. And this acts as Enkidu's civilizing process. Grant Vault, in his History of World Literature lectures, I believe, said this is symbolic of how man becomes different from the animals. Even though this isn't like the Garden of Eden situation, there's already the civilization of Uruk at this time, but it's like I don't know. It's like it's happening again. Man is becoming civilized again. So, after having gained this carnal knowledge, Enkidu finds that he can no longer run with the animals. He's become weaker. He no longer has the stamina, and the animals reject him. So he heads into civilization, where he hears about the tyranny of Gilgamesh. And what appalls him so much about Gilgamesh in particular is Gilgamesh exercises the right of first night copulation. So whenever anybody gets married in his kingdom, Gilgamesh goes over and he gets to sleep with the wife on the first night. The translator says that this is something that would have appalled the Babylonian audience, for whom this standard translation, the standard edition, the standard version was written. But he also said it may have had its origin in an earlier version of the story. But Enkidu hears it and he's appalled. So he goes to challenge Gilgamesh to a fight. Gilgamesh is also having dreams this time about a friend that he's going to meet soon. Gilgamesh and Enkidu meet, and they have this huge fight. And then at the end of the fight, they become best friends. So I guess it's like after they've both been impressed by each other's stamina and fighting style, and they become best friends. And then they go on various expeditions. So Gilgamesh is seeking glory. So he gets the idea to go to the cedar forest to attack the demon who lives there, Humbaba. Everybody tries to talk him out of it, including the elders of the city. Enkidu himself doesn't think it's such a great idea. But Gilgamesh is committed to going through with it. They go through a journey in which Gilgamesh has a series of dreams which seem to indicate they're headed for disaster, but Enkidu gives him a favorable interpretation of each dream. They arrive at the cedar forest and they have the combat with Humbaba the demon. And they're aided by the god, one of the gods who sends in a bunch of winds to subdue Humbaba. He becomes tied up. There's a debate about what to do with him. Humbaba is pleading for mercy, but Enkidu says that they should just kill him, otherwise he's going to cause them trouble. And eventually they do kill him and bring back his head and some wood from the forest, which they make into a raft and I think a door. Then Ishtar, who's the goddess of love and I think also maybe the goddess of war, falls in love with Gilgamesh and wants to copulate with him. But Gilgamesh knows her history. So she's apparently has a history of all of her lovers come to tragic ends, and he recounts that history for her. And then she gets scorned by Gilgamesh. So she goes up to heaven and asks her father, who is also a god, for the bull of heaven to come down and punish Gilgamesh and his city. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the bull and then taunt Ishtar with it. Enkidu in particular. So the gods decide that Gilgamesh and Enkidu are becoming too uppity, and they strike down Enkidu with some sort of disease. So he's lingering on his deathbed. It's point of ignominy to him that he doesn't even get to die on the battlefield. He gets taken away by this disease, an inglorious death. And Gilgamesh is devastated by the fact that his friend has died. So Gilgamesh starts to think about mortality, and he goes on a quest to find the secret of immortality. He's told by several people it's a bad idea, but he goes on the quest anyways. As he goes off into the edges of the world, he encounters various creatures like scorpion men, and he encounters a cave with a garden at the end of it. And then there's an ocean of death, and there's a ferryman who takes people across the ferry, and he uses these stone creatures to do that. Gilgamesh attacks them and destroys all the stone ones, and then demands to be taken across. And the fairy creature said, well, you just destroyed the ferryman said, you just destroyed all the stone ones. Those are the ones who were able to run the boat. But they find a way to sail across anyways using poles. And they get to the edge of the earth where Uttanapishti is. And Uttanapishti is the one mortal who the gods have granted immortality. And the reason they granted him immortality is because he was the one mortal to survive the deluge, or the great flood. So there were, way back when, the gods decided to wipe out mankind, and they made a great flood to wipe out mankind, and only one man was saved in an ark. And yeah, the story is sounding familiar. Maybe we'll come to that in a moment. So he's out in the ark, and then after 7 days, he gets stuck on a mountain as the waters are receding. He lets out the dove, but it returns because it doesn't have a place to land. He lets out the swallow, just like Noah's Ark letting out various birds. And finally, when the raven does not come back to him, then he knows that the raven has found a place to land. Again, just like the Noah's Ark story. So the gods ended up granting him immortality, but this was a one-time only thing. Gilgamesh cannot get immortality in the same way. There is a plant at the bottom of the sea which will give him youth. And Gilgamesh does dive down to get it. But then on his way back, when he stops to bathe in the water, the snake takes it. So this is the reason why the snake shed its skin. I guess it's the snake's way of continually rejuvenating, according to the myth, because the snake has got the plant that gives the rejuvenation. Gilgamesh, though, has to return with nothing, and it returns to with the ferryman and shows him the walls of the city which he has built, and which is his great accomplishment, which is the opening lines of the poem. So it comes back full circle to the opening lines, which is talking about the great walls of the city. So that's the story. And while I'm on the topic, I guess the flood story there, you can see how this was either directly or indirectly the origin for the flood story in Genesis. Directly, if the authors of the Hebrew Bible knew about the Epic of Gilgamesh and directly copied the story, or maybe indirectly in the sense that this was a story that was widespread across Mesopotamia at the time. I get the impression, after everything I've read in the translator's introduction, that there is a very good chance that the authors of the Hebrew Bible were directly familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh. It seems to have been very widespread across this whole region for a couple thousand years. According to Wikipedia, this is also had an influence on Homer and the Homeric epics. And again, according to the timeline given here, it would have still been in circulation about the time that the Iliad had been composed, which I think is, around 800 BC. So the copies of Gilgamesh are still being circulated around then. According to Wikipedia, this Epic of Gilgamesh was also referenced in some of the apocryphal books of the Bible. So even though the Epic of Gilgamesh itself got lost to history for a couple thousand years, it was influencing other works of the Western canon, which didn't get lost and did get preserved. So, it's given that incredible literary history, and given how apparently widespread this was in Mesopotamia for a couple thousand years, part of me was expecting maybe a little bit more of a story. It's all right, don't get me wrong. The bones of a good story are there. Maybe in the hands of a talented screenwriter, you could flesh it out into something interesting. There are definitely lots of little hooks that will intrigue your imagination, like the scorpion men that Gilgamesh runs into when he's at the edge of the world, or the stone men, or going to this mystical cedar forest and fighting the demon there. There are all sorts of the bones of a good story are all there. The telling of it, though, is, well, yeah. It's interesting reading it now and thinking, well, okay, this is all right, but I don't quite understand why this was so important to the Mesopotamian culture for 2,000 years. But you know, that's the thing when you read something after such a huge gap in time, when you're not familiar with the literary tradition of the culture and don't really know maybe how it was meant to be told or interpreted, or you know, I mean, who knows how spoiled we are because of all the stories that have come since that have been building on this. Maybe storytelling had our expectations for storytelling are a lot higher than they were for the people 4,000 years ago when this epic was first being put together. I'm going to try and go now and talk maybe about the reading experience, or talk more about the reading experience. So, like I said, the bones of a good story are definitely here. And certainly reading the summary of the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a lot to excite your imagination. But what about actually reading it through, cover to cover? So there are 12 tablets, actually really 11, because the 12th tablet isn't part of the same story. So, okay, 11 tablets. And each one will have a summary by the translator of what happens in that tablet. And then you read the poem, and the poem is pretty much just exactly what was in the summary. So here's the summary. Here's the poem. And you don't, in terms of details of the story, you don't really get a lot more from the actual poem than you did in the summary. And, you know, because this is a poem, and in the original language it had like a meter and rhythm and stuff like that, I don't think that, not sure how much of that has been preserved in the English translation. But because this is a poem, it's in a very poetic way. You can see maybe, let me see if I can find a good example. There are some sections that more is missing than others. So, where's a good example? There are some sections where it's possible to just read it. Here's a good example. Here's a good example of where we're missing a lot of it. And you can kind of tell what's going on here, but it's a bit of a disjointed reading experience. But there are other sections where we don't have that so much. So, for example, Tablet 11, where they're talking about the Great Flood. We actually have pretty much this whole story here, or that whole tablet. So that's a much smoother reading experience. Although it's because it's written in a poetic style, there's a lot of repetition going on in this. There's some stuff which is alluded to rather than spelled out directly, but fortunately the translator's summary tells you what happens anyway, so you know exactly what to look out for. But yeah, so here's an example maybe of the poetic style. So this is Enkidu Gilgamesh. They're traveling to... They're on their way to the cedar forest, and they're having different dreams. And each time, Gilgamesh will recite his dream in a very similar way. So So he says, "My friend, did you not call me? Why have I awakened? Did you not touch me? Why am I startled? Did a god not pass by? Why is my flesh frozen numb? My friend, I've had a second dream." And then that same verse gets repeated here. "My friend, did you not call me? Why have I awakened? Did you not touch me? Why am I startled? Did a god not pass by? Why is my flesh frozen numb? My friend, I've had a third dream." These formulas are all throughout the poem. So it gives you an appreciation for how easy it is to reconstruct the missing parts of this poem. So, for example, the rest of Tablet 2 is missing, but we can pretty much guess what is at the end of Tablet 2 just because of the formulaic nature of this whole epic, which I'll be honest, I had a hard time maybe focusing on some of this repetition in the poem. My eyes would glaze over a bit, and then I would catch myself not paying attention. And you've got to be a little bit careful with reading this poem because there's a lot of repetition and there's a lot of formula, but then important little details will just be inserted subtly. And I would catch myself missing some of those important details because I had just gotten into the habit of turning my brain off during the repetitive parts of the poem. So in that sense, it required a little bit more forcing myself to pay attention. It was kind of one of those books. Yeah, I guess as you would expect with an ancient epic, which is written in a poetic style, it doesn't read like a novel, but it's not incomprehensible either. And of course, I guess all credit for that must go to the translator for translating this into modern English in a way that's very easy to understand. I mean, despite the fact that the way in which it's told is a little bit repetitive and boring, you can totally understand what's going on. So it's not difficult in that regard. Something I mentioned earlier, but perhaps I didn't complete the thought. The translator mentions that more and more pieces are being found all the time, both through new archaeological digs, and also it turns out with I think some of this is just coming up on the black market being traded, and the translator said we have a lot of tablets in the museum that people haven't even gotten around to translating yet because there's a shortage of qualified Assyrianologists, people who study Assyria and the Assyrian languages. I guess this translator must have been one of the few people who can decipher this. And indeed, this edition came out in the 90s, according to the copyright. Where's the copyright here? 1999? Late 90s. So since that time, I think new pieces of the poem have come to light. I was just searching on the internet, and there's a Reddit post from about 5 years ago, how we got a little bit more about, I believe it was Tablet 5, the Cedar Forest, had been successfully translated. So presumably the next edition of this, which comes out, is going to be have even more of the poem, which is what the translator says in the introduction. He says, okay, we don't have the whole poem, but he says we've got more of the poem than we had in 1850 when it was first discovered. And he said, in another 50 years we're going to have even more of the poem. And he didn't say we would ever get to the point where we'd reconstruct the whole thing. Perhaps that's being a little bit too optimistic. But it is interesting to think that more and more pieces of it are coming together all the time. So at some point, we'll have, if not the whole thing, at least a much fuller understanding of it. He does, the translator Will he's going through this will mention which tablets he's working off of. So, for example, here he's talking, this is tablet 2, and at this part in the text he says, here tablet 2 becomes fragmentary again, and the episode is best taken from the old Babylonian Pennsylvania tablet. So the Pennsylvania tablet, I think so named because it's currently being housed in a museum in Pennsylvania, is a different version of the story, which is different from the standard version, but which we can use to fill in gaps from the standard version. And then here, tablet 2 resumes again. Now we have another gap in tablet 2. And so now the old Babylonian tablet, which is a different version of the story, helps to fill it in. So because we have all these different versions of the story which are floating around in Mesopotamia and being discovered in archaeological digs and stuff like that, we have the standard version, but we also have a bunch of different versions and we've got like I think a version in Hittite as well, some different language versions. And so whenever he runs into a serious gap in the text, he just inserts material from the other versions to fill in the story. Yep. And you can see this is all the way through the text. He's constantly saying, okay, here's another gap, so we're going to go to this version to fill in the story. Here's another gap, so now we're going to the Yale tablet, which is a Babylonian tablet in Yale, which has a different version of the story. And those Pennsylvania and Yale tablets, which he refers to, after you get through the standard version, you can actually read those here. This is part of the extra stuff that's at the end of the book. Now, there was certainly a part of me which was reading this, which was thinking, do I really need to know all this? I mean, I'm not writing a thesis on Gilgamesh. I'm not doing any scholarly work on this. And in 5 years, am I really going to remember which part of the story came from the standard version and which part of the story came from the Yale tablet and which part of the story came from the Pennsylvania tablet? Like, I appreciate that the translator's doing all this work to fill me in on where these different verses are coming, but I'm not a scholar. I'm a casual reader. Maybe just give me the story, and I don't care which comes from which tablet. Leave that for the scholarly audiences. But then, maybe that's what I get for using the Penguin Classic version of the epic. I suspect simpler versions are out there. I didn't actually choose the Penguin Classic. This is just what was in my library at my school. I'm out here in Vietnam, so my access to books is limited. Just to English language books is limited. I just have what is in my school library. But yeah, it is interesting, I guess, getting a little bit of a peek behind the curtain to see how this story is put together. The translator does mention at some point in his introduction, he said it may be tempting to just synthesize all these versions together and put them into a prose story and just paper over the gaps. But he said, I believe that no adult reader is best served that way. So in other words, if you're a child, fine. We'll give you the summary of the Epic of Gilgamesh. But if you're an adult, then it's time for you to put up with the gaps in the text and to be told when the tablet breaks off and when we're going to supplementary material. That's you're an adult now, you can handle this. That seems to be what he's saying. Although he himself said his first encounter with this was when he read the Penguin Classics series by Nancy Saddars from 1960, the predecessor of this book, which was a prose synthesis of the ancient poems. Yeah. So, maybe I could have done with just a prose synthesis of the ancient poem. And in an ideal world, I think maybe you would start off with a prose synthesis of the ancient poem. I'm a believer that you work your way up to the harder stuff. So your first encounter with the Epic of Gilgamesh probably should be just a prose retelling of it. And then once you've gone through a couple prose retellings of it, and maybe once you've read a history of the Mesopotamia, then you can read the authentic version with all the missing words in it, and with all the gaps in the text, and with all the information about which comes from which tablet. So to a certain extent, maybe starting right off with this more scholarly edition is not ideal, but like I said, that was the version that was in my school library. And then there's the different versions in the back once you finish the standard version. And there's even at the very back, the last appendices, is a note on the translation, which again takes you behind the curtain a little bit with how this is translated and put together. Now, again, this was, for the casual reader, maybe this is information I didn't need to know, but it was interesting to a certain extent. It talks about how there are these different fragments. Fragments get assembled. So I guess these two pieces were discovered in like different areas, but they were assembled together. Then once you've got the different fragments assimilated, then you decipher the cuneiforms. He talks about the difficulty with deciphering the cuneiforms for a number of different ways. One is which they're kind of three-dimensionally written on these tablets, apparently. So the paper drawings don't actually do them full justice. But then once you've got them there, then you can start putting in the transliterations of it. And then once you've got a few different transliterations from these fragments, then you put them together, and then all of a sudden you get in the full text. And then you can put that into Roman letters, and just all the different steps that you would go through to take these fragments and then end up with whole verses out of them, and then translate them into English. So it's not like translating, like a Greek. It's not like translating Homer or Plutarch or, like a Greek or Roman text, where you're like, okay, here's the text. Now I just translate it. First, the translator has to assemble the text from all these different fragments. And then once you've got the text assembled, then you can begin to translate it. So it's interesting stuff to a certain degree. I'm not sure I would have wanted to go too much more in depth on it, but that little bit was interesting as far as it went. Speaking of this text, I was talking to a coworker at work at lunch, and he was asking me about the book I was reading. I was trying to explain the history of the Epic of Gilgamesh. I know I can be a real nerd at the lunchtime conversation, and how. But I was trying to explain how it was really widespread over the Mesopotamian world for 2,000 years, and then just got lost to history. And my coworker said, "Well, what happened? Did they burn all the libraries? How did it get lost to history?" And I said, "I don't think so." I said, "I think people just lost interest in it. Maybe the historical centers shifted over to the Greek and Roman worlds, and people just stopped copying the Epic of Gilgamesh." It's actually not entirely clear from this introduction why it got forgotten. The appendix at the end makes it clear that libraries were definitely smashed, but it wasn't a systematic attempt to suppress this literature. It's just that when a city got sacked, the library got smashed. It was just something that happened in the ancient world. But yeah, I think it was just a simple matter of people losing interest in this, and I guess maybe people became more interested in Homer and the Bible and other ancient texts. And as the Babylonian civilization fell, people weren't preserving this. But the good news is, I mean, the reason that we have so much of it uncovered by archaeologists is because the Babylonians didn't use papyrus. They used clay tablets, or maybe they used papyrus as well, but they used a lot of clay tablets that were baked and have survived through the millennium rather well. I mean, they get broken into fragments, but then those fragments can be reassembled. Yeah, as the translator shows in some of these pictures here, the fragments can be reassembled, and it has been possible to reassemble a lot of this text in that way. So, yeah. Another classic under my belt, and an interesting one. Perhaps has come through in this review. The reading about the Epic of Gilgamesh, and reading about the evolution of the poem, and reading about the Sumerian and Akkadian and Babylonian literary traditions, all which come from the 50 pages in the translator's introduction, and then reading about how the poem has been pieced together in the modern world. To a certain extent, that's almost more interesting than the poem itself. The story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the part I summarized on this video, is interesting for what it was. Like I said, it had its hooks in there. I mean, it's not epic like Homer is epic in terms of like tons of characters and really big war and all the gods and everything. But it's interesting reading through the actual poem, the actual verse rendition of it. Like I said, can be a little bit. I don't know. I prefer to read prose rather than verse. But some parts of it are actually more interesting than others. There are some parts, particularly the repetitive parts, where my eyes were glazing over a little bit. But then there were some parts which actually were quite interesting. So the beginning with Enkidu's being tamed and brought into civilization was quite interesting. The story of the big deluge, the flood, in Book 11, that was quite interesting. So parts of it were more interesting than others. Okay, I'm beginning to ramble and repeat myself, so that's a sign that it's time to stop the video here. Thank you very much.